Hello and welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. I'm Jeff Paur, senior editor at RealTime Fantasy Sports, and it is time for starts, sits, and sleepers for week 2 of the fantasy football season. I'm going to do this every week. I'm going to give you 3 starts at quarterback, running back, and receiver, 3 sits at those positions as well, and 1 sleeper, and then at tight end. Since the position is a little more shallow, I'll give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper there. And I'm going to keep track each week. I'm going to let you know how I'm doing. Be completely transparent with you. If I have a bad week, I'm going to let you know. If I have a good week, I'm going to let you know. And if I have a mediocre week, which I did last week, I'm going to let you know as well. I went 14-12 last week, just so. I want to be around that 70% mark when it comes to these selections. But I am picking people that are not surefire starters. That's the whole reason for doing this. You don't want to listen to a video of me telling you to start Joe Burrow or Jalen Hurts. That's just not going to help you. So I'm going to try to give you some players that you might be on the fence about starting and help you out there. But last week I was 14-12. Let's hope I do better this week, a little bit better for you. And I'm going to start at the QB position as always, and I'm going to start with the starts at QB. My first one is Justin Fields. He really had a great opener. He scored 31.7 fantasy points. I thought the Jets did a fabulous job of using him offensively. They did a great job. They were run heavy. They used the play action to his favor. They also used his legs. I thought he looked great. I think he's going to keep it going this week against the Bills. They allowed the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks last week. They played the Ravens, similar type player to Lamar Jackson. Fields is obviously Fields isn't quite in the same category as Jackson, but he's the similar dual threat type player. I think he can have some more success this week. I'm believing him as a QB1 in my lineup. My next start at quarterback is Kyler Murray. He threw for just 163 yards last week and 2 touchdowns, but he managed to get 20 fantasy points. I thought he played a solid game. He gets to play the Panthers at home this week. This is not a very good defensive team. I think Murray can up his numbers a little bit better than what he did last week when he threw for just 163 yards. I think he'll get it going and have a really good fantasy week for all his owners. My last start at QB is Drake May of the New England Patriots. He's another guy, kind of like Murray, just a okay opener, but it wasn't bad by any means. He threw for 287 yards and a touchdown. I thought he made some good throws, and he gets the Dolphins this week. This is a prime matchup. That team was an absolute disaster last week against the Colts. They made Daniel Jones look like the second coming of Patrick Mahomes. I think May can have a big game in this matchup. I think he's a really good start for all of his fantasy owners. All right, let's go to my sits at QB now. My first one is actually a guy that just played that Dolphins team, and that's Daniel Jones. So, again, he had a phenomenal opener. He led all fantasy quarterbacks in scoring. He did this against the Dolphins, so they look terrible. I think he has a much tougher test this week. He gets the Broncos. I think they might have the best defense in football. They completely shut down the Titans last week, allowed the fewest fantasy points to QBs. Jones is definitely not a guy you can just plug in your lineup right now and use as an every week starter. I think I would bench him in this matchup. It worries me a lot. My next sit at quarterback is Brock Purdy of the San Francisco 49ers. He's banged up. Sounds like he's a little iffy to play. I think he will play. I don't think they'll hold him out. But he goes on the road against the Saints, and who does he have left to throw to? Juwan Jennings, he was hurt in that game. He's looking really iffy to play, and George Kittle was put on IR as well. He's already without Brandon Ayuk. So it just really worries me. Some people might think the Saints are a great matchup on paper, but I think it's going to be the Christian McCaffrey show once again. He's going to get a ton of touches this week, and I would avoid Purdy because of all the injuries and a matchup against the Saints defense that actually isn't too bad as well. My last sit at QB is Matthew Stafford of the Rams. The back didn't seem to be an issue last week. That was the real positive, but he scored just 16.3 fantasy points. Didn't do a whole lot, and he has a tougher matchup this week on the road against the Titans. They really did a good job of holding Bo Nix down in week 1, and that was on the road. Now they're at home. I would just avoid Stafford in this matchup. I don't see him posting very big numbers. My last category of the QB position is a sleeper, and it is Joe Flacco. I think Flacco is a good sleeper this week. He looked good in the opener. He threw for 290 yards and a touchdown, but most importantly, he aired it out 45 times. The Browns really had trouble running the ball once again. I think it could be a pass-first offense much of the year, especially this week against the Ravens. They could be playing from behind. Baltimore struggled to stop the pass last week. So I think Flacco's a good streaming option for this week. I think he could have a pretty big game. Sure, he might turn the ball over, but I also think he's going to post some yards and score a couple touchdowns. All right, let's look at the running back position. My first start at running back is Jaylen Warren of the Steelers. Did have a great opener, but he had 13 touches, found the end zone, scored 13.9 fantasy points. Didn't do a whole lot on the ground, though. I think he gets it going this week against Seattle. They're really good against the pass, but they struggle to stop the run. Seahawks allowed the most fantasy points of running backs last week. I think Warren really gets it going. He's the lead back in that offense, and he's going to get a lot of touches here. My next start is Javonte Williams of the Cowboys. He showed last week he used to clear top back for the Cowboys right now. He played 77% of the snaps, dominated the carries, scored twice against a really good Eagles rush defense. He has a much easier matchup this week against the Giants. They allowed 220 rushing yards in week 1. I think Williams, if he gets the touches like he did last week, he could have a really big game. My next start at running back is Zach Charbonnet of the Seattle Seahawks. He found the end zone last week. He played 58% of the snaps compared to 40% for Kenneth Walker. This was a real surprise to fantasy owners, but it looks like Charbonnet might be the lead back in this offense right now. They're going to be really run heavy with the way they like to attack defenses. They play the Steelers this week. They couldn't stop the Jets on the ground at all last week. I think both these backs are going to be good plays, but Charbonnet is probably the better option right now, and I would definitely have him in my lineup for this week. All right, let's look at 3 sits now at running back. My first one is James Cook. Really had a good opener. He scored 21.2 fantasy points. Didn't do a whole lot on the ground, though. He ran 13 times for just 44 yards. His work in the passing game really saved him. He had some big gains in the passing game, but I think he's going to struggle to run against the Jets this week. New York allowed just 53 rushing yards last week. It's tough to bench Cook, but I would just temper my expectations for him in week 2. Maybe use him as a flex play. Just don't expect those big numbers in this tough matchup. My next sit is Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt of the Washington Commanders. Really had a great opener. He looked fantastic, lived up to the hype, ran 10 times for 82 yards and a touchdown. But here's my concerns. He didn't catch a pass, and he played just 33% of the snaps. I don't think he's a plug-and-play option just yet. He gets the Packers this week. They allowed just 46 rushing yards to a high-powered Lions running game last week. So that's a really good Lions rushing attack. They couldn't do anything against his defense. I'm not sure Krosky-Merritt's going to find a ton of room to run here, and he doesn't catch passes as well. So I might leave him on my bench for this week. Another guy I might leave on my bench at running back is David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions, who I just mentioned. The offense just didn't look great last week. And also, Montgomery played just 25 snaps in that game compared to 44 for Jahmyr Gibbs. Gibbs has really jumped to the lead of that backfield. It's not near the split of last year. He gets the Bears as well. Pretty solid overall defense. I think this Lions offense could have some growing pains early in the year with so much turnover at the coaching staff, offensive line as well. So Montgomery is a bit of a concern for me right now. My sleeper running back is Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals. He didn't exactly split the carries in week 1, but it was fairly close. He played 33% of the snaps, and he actually led the Cardinals in rushing while starter James Conner kind of struggled to do much on the ground. I think it's going to become more of a split going forward, and it could be this week against Carolina, who was gashed on the ground. They allowed 200 rushing yards to the Jags last week. I think Benson's an intriguing flex play in a matchup where he could get a lot of touches. All right, let's look at the receiver position now for start, sits, and sleepers. My start at receiver is a guy who did nothing last week, really aggravated his fantasy owners, and that's A.J. Brown. He was the forgotten man of that offense, but man, don't forget about him. He's been phenomenal the last several years. He's going to get a lot of looks, I think, early and often in this game against the Chiefs. They allowed the most fantasy points to receivers in week 1. I think Brown's going to put his poor showing in week 1 behind him in a hurry in this matchup. He's going to get a lot of looks from the Eagles. My next start is Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Bucks. Emeka Egbuka, he got more of the looks last week, especially in the red zone. Evans still had a decent game, though. He had 5 catches for 51 yards, targeted 8 times in that game, so still getting a lot of looks. He plays Houston this week. They could not stop the Rams' number 1 receiver last week, Puka Nacua, and they allowed the 7th most fantasy points to receivers in that game. I think Evans is going to have one of his signature big games in week 2 in this matchup. My next start is Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. So he was another guy that disappointed in week 1, but I think if Miami wants to do anything offensively, they have to get him heavily involved to get this offense going. So I think he's going to get a lot of looks on maybe bubble screens, reverses, you name it. I think Hill's going to get a ton of targets against the Patriots this week. They allowed 333 passing yards to the Raiders last week. I think Hill's going to be a guy that has a really big week 2. All right, my sits at receiver. My first sit is Calvin Austin of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He was the clear number 2 receiver for the Steelers last week, played 80% of the snaps. That's really encouraging for him, but I still don't consider him a guy I'm just going to throw in my lineup and feel good about him. I think he's more of a spot play. In a game against Seattle this week, I've mentioned them a few times. I think they're actually going to do really well on the ground against the Seahawks, but they're going to struggle through the air. That's kind of been Seattle's MO the last few seasons. They allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to receivers in week 1, so I would steer clear of Austin here. This is not the matchup to use him. Another one of my sits at receiver is George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys. Just 4 targets last week in that game and just didn't get a whole lot of looks. It was a tough matchup against the Eagles. He has another tough matchup this week against the Giants, so they allowed just 212 passing yards to a very good Commanders pass offense last week. So I think Pickens could have another ho-hum game in this matchup. Just kind of temper your expectations for him in week 2. My last sit is Matthew Golden of the Green Bay Packers. There was a lot of buzz about him being the clear number 1 receiver for Green Bay this year, but he played just 66% of the snaps, did not lead all of the Packers receivers in playing time, which is kind of disheartening a little bit. He had just 2 catches on 2 targets. He's still battling a host of receivers for playing time. I think he's going to be up and down right now unless his playing time snap usage starts to really get going forward in the coming weeks. And he plays the Commanders this week. They allowed just 157 passing yards week 1. So I think Golden's a guy I might sit if you have better options to use. My sleeper at receiver is Jaden Higgins of the Houston Texans. The Texans passing game struggled once again, kind of looked like last year in that opener. But Higgins, he played some, just not a ton. He played the 4th most of all the Texans receivers, but he had 2 catches for 32 yards on 3 targets. He made some plays, and I think if they want to get this passing game going, they got to go with the younger options, give Higgins more of a chance. I think he's going to get more playing time this week in week 2. They need to start doing something in this passing game, and I think Higgins gives them the best chance to make some big plays. And he gets the Bucs, a team that allowed 289 passing yards last week. All right, let's look at the tight end position now before we get out of here. I'll give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and then a sleeper at tight end. My starts, it's hard for me to do this, but I'm going to recommend Kyle Pitts. The Falcons are really banged up at receiver right now. Not much left. Drake London's banged up. Darnell Mooney. I think Pitts looked really good last week. 7 catches for 59 yards on 8 targets. I think he could rack up the targets this week against the Vikings. That's a good defense, but I think the volume is going to be there for Pitts to do some good things in week 2. My next start at tight ends, Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots. He had an encouraging 8 targets in the opener, had 4 catches for 66 yards. That's a solid game for a number 1 tight end. Tyler Warren was running free all over last week, this Dolphins defense which is who Henry plays this week. So I think he can also run free in that Dolphins secondary and make some big plays. I like Henry a lot in this matchup. All right, my sits at tight end. My first one's TJ Hawkinson of the Minnesota Vikings. He had just 3 catches last week for 15 yards. It was a disappointing, really, opener for him, but the entire Vikings passing game really struggled until late in that Monday night game. I'm still a tad worried about Hawkinson right now. He did not have quite that season many thought he would last year, and now he plays the Falcons this week. They didn't allow a single fantasy point to the tight end in week 1. I think if you have better options to use a tight end right now, I would consider doing them until Hawkinson starts to show more on the field. My last sit is rookie tight end Mason Taylor of the New York Jets. He got a lot of preseason buzz, a lot of people excited about him, but he had just a catch in week 1, not really involved a whole lot. I think until he really does something on the field, fantasy owners should be wary about using him. He also is another guy with a tough matchup against the Bills, who really shut down the tight end last week, allowed just 1.5 fantasy points to the tight end in week 1. All right, my sleeper at tight end, I'm going to leave you with Brenton Strange of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Really looked good in that opener, despite the entire Jags passing game being pretty ho-hum once again. Strange had 4 catches for 59 yards. He's getting a lot of praise from his coaching staff and teammates. I think he's going to have a breakout season. Week 1 did nothing to discourage that. I think he's going to do well again this week against Cincinnati. A team that allowed the fourth most fantasy points to tight ends in week 1. All right, those are my starts, sits, and sleepers for week 2 of the fantasy season. Good luck to all of you in your games. I hope you have a lot of success this week and win all your matchups. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports. Have a great day.